10-Minute Jazz Lesson Podcast, episode 406. Hey, everybody, welcome back to episode 406 of the 10-Minute Jazz Lesson Podcast. New month, new series. And this month, we're going to be taking a look at the power of small pieces of vocabulary. And let me get into it right away why I'm doing this. So, I think when we learn vocabulary, we're convinced that we have to learn these big, long pieces of vocabulary, like, let's say, a three measure 251. And one of the things that happens is, first of all, a piece of vocabulary that long is really hard to memorize. And then it's also sort of, I think, in the minds of many jazz students, expected that we actually use that vocabulary verbatim when we're improvising. And this is one of the biggest questions I get as a teacher over the years is like, I can't seem to, I spent all this time learning this really long piece of eighth note vocabulary that is all eighth notes over the course of three measures. But anytime that I go to use it in my solo, I can't. I can't seem to get it all to come out the way that I want it to. Inevitably, I mess up somewhere in the middle, and then the piece of vocabulary flies out the window, and it's like a total train wreck in my solo. So if you're sitting there listening to this and that's you, I think what we're going to talk about this month is really going to help you to maybe see vocabulary in a different light and actually give you some pieces of vocabulary that are really portable and that will actually fit into a larger statement without sort of detouring from what you were playing to put this line into your solo. And I think if all jazz students considered this way of learning vocabulary that we're going to talk about this month, uh, the world would be an easier place for all of you. So, what we're going to do is we are going to use the amazing tune Donna Lee to practice this concept. Because this chord progression, it really, really does have so many devices that we're going to see in hundreds and hundreds of other tunes. It has some of the most important chord movements possible. And the melody itself is this insane source of really, really awesome jazz vocabulary. So we're going to be using Donna Lee this month, and we're going to get into it a little bit. Okay, so basically the premise of this is that we're going to take tiny, tiny, tiny little snippets of jazz vocabulary, and we're going to work them through the chord progression of Donna Lee. And we're going to start with the opening phrase of what happens in Donna Lee. Okay, so the first thing that we hear in Donna Lee is this little tiny phrase that sounds like this. Now, in the actual tune, it happens on beat 3. So it's 1, 2, right? And then it keeps going. But what we're going to do is we're going to take this little piece of vocabulary and we're going to think about what it actually does just over that first chord. And we're actually going to move it onto beat 1. So if we think about an A flat chord and we think about that phrase over it, well, what it's actually doing is it's starting on the 7th and it's doing this triplet from the 7th to the 1. And then it's going down the A flat scale with a passing tone, a chromatic passing tone between 6 and 5. And then it lands on 5 if we're thinking about it all over that A flat major 7 chord, concert A flat major 7 chord. Okay. So this is what we are going to take, and we're going to try to apply this to every single chord in Donna Lee. So let's play it over the first chord. And what we also realize is that it lands on beat 3. So it's 1 triplet, 2, and 3. Okay. So now I'm going to take the structure of that piece of vocabulary, and now I'm going to try to apply it to every chord that I see. So what's the next chord? Well, it's F7, concert F7. So if we were to apply that shape of 7, 1, 7, 6, flat 6, 5 to F7, we would get this. Now, what's the next chord? Well, the next chord is a concert B flat 7 chord. So again, 7, 1, 7, 6, flat 6, 5. Then we have that chord again, so we would play it again. Now we go to B flat minor 7, but the line will be exactly the same thing. And then we have E flat 7. Then we're back to A flat. So now if we take all of those and we put this little tiny piece of vocabulary on beat 1 of every measure, it sounds like this. 1, 2, 3, 4. Right? So can you kind of hear the chord progression in there? That's what's really nice about this too, is it's actually a great way to hear a progression with just a little tiny, really simple piece of vocabulary. So now if I were to put the roots underneath it, you would really hear that this sort of traces the harmony. 1, 2, 3, 4. Isn't that nice? So, what's advantageous about this? Why am I showing you this? Well, here's the thing, it is a piece of vocabulary that you can literally put everywhere, which, if you're learning a big piece of like 251 vocabulary, which I think is the most common thing that jazz students do, you can only put it over the 251, right? Whereas this little tiny piece of vocabulary can be applied over literally every single chord in the tune, which is really awesome. And it's much, much, much easier to remember that structure of 7, 1, 7, 6, flat 6, 5 is so easy to remember. You think about that for, a minute, and then you've got it in your head. And then all you have to do is you have to think about that little tiny piece of vocabulary and apply it to all these different chord qualities, right? So it does a whole bunch of things for us. First of all, it does give us vocabulary. Believe it or not, what you don't have to do with this, which I think is really, really nice, you don't have to memorize it and then try to put it in everywhere. That's the step that you get to skip when you're dealing with this way of practicing vocabulary. All you need to do is take the action, put it in over all the chords, and then forget about it. And believe it or not, with enough of this work, you will start to play some of this stuff naturally. And the sort of kicker of this kind of stuff is that it will fit itself into larger phrases that you're playing, right? So if you think about a big long piece of vocabulary, I liken it to a recipe. right? So a big long piece of vocabulary is like, okay, I'm learning how to make this dish, okay, this specific dish. And then I'm going to recreate everything that is in the recipe. And I'm going to come up with the complete finished dish that this recipe is teaching. Whereas learning these little pieces of vocabulary is like learning how to take ingredients and improvise your own dish, right? So, like, understanding how to prepare something really, really well, and then fitting it into a dish that is your own creation at the end of the day. Okay. I don't know about you, but I would much rather approach cooking in a way that, hey, I know how to manipulate all these different ingredients so that I can come up with all these creative dishes on my own instead of, oh, geez, I got to pull out the recipe book and I got to follow this 3-page recipe from beginning to end, not miss a step. Oh, if I mess up in the middle, the dish is going to be ruined. Right. So I don't know if that analogy works, but that's what came to my mind. So here's what I'm going to do for the Patreon members this week. I'm going to create a play along, basically, a demonstration track that's me putting that piece of vocabulary over every single chord. And what I'm going to do is I'm going to simplify a few of the places in the tune where there's like 2 chords per measure. We're going to simplify that down to 1 chord, and you're going to see sort of the power of it. And then I'm also just going to create some trading tracks like I normally do, so that we're sort of like working on Donna Lee in a more meta way, but we're also each week going to be selecting a part of the melody that is interesting, and we're going to be taking that through and working on these little tiny pieces of vocabulary that, if you do it for long enough, are going to completely change your playing. And that's the thing about this, is that you can't just do one and expect your playing to transform overnight. You've got to constantly be working on these little tiny pieces of vocabulary. But what you're going to notice is that with enough work, you start getting this incredible like fluency in your playing, and your phrases become longer and they become more effortless because you have all this stuff underneath your fingers and in your ears, and you could start putting these ingredients together on the fly and creating delicious meals without having to follow a recipe. Okay. So, Patreon members will get all that stuff. If you don't know what I'm talking about, we are a listener supported podcast, which means like we don't do any advertisements on the show or anything like that. Instead, what we do is we rely on listeners like you to keep us going in the form of a very small monthly donation. And in return for that, you get a bunch of materials with every single episode. So if you want to know more about that, we use the Patreon platform to support this show. So you can go to our website, 10minutejazzlesson.com, click on one of the Patreon banners and get yourself signed up. Or you can simply go to patreon.com, search for the 10-Minute Jazz Lesson Podcast, and you can sign up that way. Shout out to our new patrons this week, Philippe, Mike, and Bill. Thank you so much for joining up with the 10-Minute Jazz Lesson Podcast, and to everybody over there that's been supporting us for any period of time. Really, really appreciate it. Couldn't do this show without you. So we'll be back next week with another episode of these small pieces of vocabulary. Got one of my favorites for next week. So have a great weekend, everybody, and we will talk to you soon. Bye.